Welcome to Seminary Dropout, interviews with leading theologians, biblical scholars, leaders, and thinkers, asking questions and having conversations that help us better understand God and ourselves. For believers and doubters alike, let's go. Rich Villodas, welcome to Seminary Dropout. It's great to have you.
Shane, great to be with you, my friend. I look forward to a good conversation with you.
Yeah, same. We've kind of known each other for a while, and I can't believe this is the first time I've had you. I think we tried to make it happen in the past and just couldn't work out.
Yeah.
For those who don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself in your context and all that good stuff.
Yeah. Born in Brooklyn, raised in Brooklyn. After 3 decades living in Brooklyn, I moved 15 minutes to Queens and lived there for 10 years before moving another 20 minutes to a place called Long Island, New York. And so New Yorker through and through, married to Rosie for almost 20 years. It'll be 20 years next year. 15-year-old daughter, 10-year-old son. And for the last 16 years, I've been at a church called New Life Fellowship, founded by a guy named Pete Scazzaro, who led the church for 26 years. And I succeeded Pete 12 years ago. And so lead that wonderful congregation, a church with about 80 nations represented in the community, in an area where National Geographic called the most diverse zip code in the world, 123 languages spoken in the neighborhood. It's a beautiful place and a very challenging place to be a pastor as well, but beautiful, beautiful people and a joy to serve and lead there.
You've got like over 75 languages represented in your church. Is that right?
Not so much language. Well, probably. It's really more so the nations that are represented. However, in the local neighborhood where our church is at, there are 123 languages that are spoken. So it is quite a place. To give you a sense, like the local Chase Bank, to take out $20 at the local ATM, there's at least 12 languages, maybe, that's like on this. So it's it's a very at times dizzying, and yet at the same time very beautiful place in our world.
That's so cool. You mentioned Pete Scazzaro. He's been on this podcast before. Huge fan. Emotionally healthy spirituality, like huge for like a lot of people. That was like a big deal for me, like a really big help. And from what I gather, he kind of took those principles, and your church really seeks to embody them. And from what I understand, there's like, as the pastor there are requirements of you to take care of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, when I was interviewed by Pete in 2008, I never forgot the moment in the diner 2 blocks down from the church where I was with Pete and his wife, Jerry. My wife, Rosie, was there. And I ordered a grilled cheese sandwich with French fries, and he kept grabbing at my French fries, which was very unsettling during the interview. And he said something to the effect of, if you don't Sabbath weekly, you'll probably get fired from our church because you're not going to have the kind of life with God to sustain the work you're doing for God. And so that kind of gave me a really quick introduction into the kind of culture around cultivating a life with God for the sake of the work that we're doing. And, having him as a mentor to this day, but specifically when we were working very closely together, has been one of the great gifts of my life.
Yeah, I can't imagine having a resource like him. And they're still a part of the church, correct?
To some degree. I mean, since 2020, for the first 7 years, from 2013 to 2020, they were very involved in the life of our church. The last 5 years, slowly, that's gone down significantly. And so while there's still relational connection, of course, they're not nearly as involved in the life of the church as they once were.
Yeah. I'm curious how, like, in any church, I feel like part of the pastor's role is like kind of balancing interests that can be competing interests sometimes, and I would, it's like, it even goes back to scripture, right? Like I'm in the middle of a class right now at Northern on the epistles, and, reading Romans, and like Paul's whole thing is like, how do we integrate these cultures, into a new people, and everybody gets to be, what you came from, but you also have this radical new identity in Christ as well, Yeah. And I think any pastor can relate to that dynamic. How much more so when you've got people from all over the world and different cultures. And I don't know what the question is. How do you manage that?
Well, on one level, I would say managing that is always going to be done imperfectly. And saying imperfect makes it seem as if that's close to perfect. It's like there are times where we're going to just struggle through this because at any point in the life of our church in a given year, someone doesn't feel seen, someone doesn't feel appreciated, someone doesn't feel valued. I think that's just the nature of a community with this much diversity. And so I think if we can, number one, begin to normalize to be part of a church this diverse means that at any given point in the year, there are going to be groups of people, whether we're talking generationally, whether we're talking socioeconomically, whether we're talking ethnically, racially, culturally, across the board, politically. Some folks are not going to be seen. And the question is not trying to eliminate that, but the question is how can we be honest with that? How can we recognize the moments where we need to ask for forgiveness in those spaces? And at the same time, how do we celebrate our distinctions well? And so a big part of navigating a space like where I'm at has to do a lot with our ability to celebrate our distinctiveness without disconnecting from one another. What does it mean to abide with God and abide with one another? I think part of that is we're distinct, but our distinctions don't automatically have to lead to our disconnection. And I think that's more art than science. I think it's listening to the pulse of what's going on in our community. What are the stories that need to be highlighted? What are the fears that need to be named? And in a given year, I think I lead that sometimes well and lead that with some significant gaps. But again, we're a family. Part of the family is naming the gaps, asking for forgiveness, and trying to learn to do it better moving forward.
You have been on a tear of writing in the last several years. You came out with A Deeply Formed Life in 21 and Good and Beautiful Kind in 2023. And last year came out with The Narrow Path. Do you feel like, to me, there seems like a heavy cohesion of those three books.
Yeah. Was
that planned? Did you always see it that way? Or were you kind of just taking it one at a time?
Truly one at a time, but I've had kind of a repository of reflections, content, things that I'm passionate about, books that I've read, pieces that I've written, whether publicly or in my own journals. And so each of these, I think, emerged out of a particular moment in context. Like The Deeply Formed Life, for example, came out because I was trying to create a manual for our leaders to navigate the 5 values of our congregation well. And it just so happened that as I started writing that, I began to wonder if this piece could be a fresh approach to spiritual formation for this generation, holding together aspects that are often compartmentalized. And so, but it started with local congregation, let me help our leaders. It turned into something larger than that. For Good and Beautiful and Kind, when I was writing that in 2021, 2022, I'm looking at all of the fractures that exist in our world. 2020 was a year that I would call it was a CPR year, a year that we found the convergence of COVID, political idolatry, racial hostility, and the convergence of those three forces led to so much fragmentation. And so for me, I was trying to name what's the theological language that we need to understand our fractures, which I go with sin, powers and principalities, and trauma. And then what's the kind of interior life and exterior life that leads to wholeness. So that was the second book. And then the third book, I think emerged more out of my own personal journey of following Jesus, in that when I became a Christian at 19, the portion of scripture that was most important in my formation at the early stages, because of my grandfather's influence in my life, was the Psalms and the Sermon on the Mount. And so because the question I was asking with the narrow path was, there's a lot of people who are claiming faithfulness to Jesus, and saying we're following Jesus correctly. And I was wrestling with the question, how do we know with greater discernment that we are actually being faithful to Jesus? And I think Jesus has made it plain for us in the Sermon on the Mount. And so I felt more of a pastoral as well as a cultural urgency to be clearer as it relates to what faithfulness to the way of Jesus looks like. And so I didn't have these ideas primarily in 2019 before I wrote the first one, but slowly I'm trying to pay attention, first of all, pastorally, to what the particular group of people God has entrusted under my care. What do they need? And then I think in light of that, maybe how can the church outside of our local congregation benefit as well?
Yeah, I can see that. I love that. Going back to the Deeply Formed Life, the first one. Yeah. Man, like you tackle so much in that. There's like, spiritual disciplines, and then there's racial justice, and there's sexual integrity. Like there's like no stone unturned in that. There's like a lot there. Like what did you, and I get that you were, you mentioned this was part of kind of your church's kind of core, some core values that you were hammering out. It feels like that was really born out of very much like boots on the ground pastoral work from being with people.
Yeah. So I would say yes. And so yes, 100%. It feels that book emerged out of the life of our community. And I think it also emerged out of years of theological reflection on incarnation, resurrection, new heavens, new earth. And because of those things, these theological categories, something has to be said about the way that we show up in the world. Something has to be said about our bodies. Something has to be said about our relationships one to another. And so incarnation, resurrection, new heavens, new earth, for me was the impetus behind, we have to talk about spirituality and matters of race, and spirituality and matters of sexuality in our bodies, and all the rest there, and justice. So on one end is the theological reflection that I've given myself to over a number of years, I think since maybe 2004, 2005, trying to hold these things together, as well as boots on the ground, pastoring this unique group of Jesus followers in Queens, and what's the fruit that I've seen through our particular values here. So the convergence of those two, I think, is what led to kind of a certainly not a comprehensive approach, but something that's trying to cover lots of different things in one particular project.
I mean, I think what I like about that is that it really does bring together. I don't want to like juxtapose theological with practical, but I think what I mean is, if you take a look at like something like the creeds, which I think are really important and I affirm. Yeah. But I've asked myself, could you sign on to the creeds and be like an avowed white supremacist, right? The ultimate answer, I think, is no, but that's only if you understand what it means to believe and proclaim that Jesus is Lord, right? Like that saying that Jesus is Lord is not just kind of arranging the cognitive furniture in your mind, but it's actually something we embody, and that has implications for how we see our neighbor, and so would have implications for racial justice. And so, but I think that too rarely do we put that together. Like, do we name that like, yes, like this theological component is important, but here's the implications for your life on your, the way you see your neighbor, your sexual integrity, all that kind of stuff,
Which I think, Shane, goes to, I have so appreciated those who have written on matters of formation and discipleship. And yet what I have seen, that what has been glaringly missing is the integration of our life with God. And what does that mean for not just our souls, but for the systems that we live in as well. And so that's where I have found spiritual formation to be anemic in how many approach it, with this formational compartmentalization, where we're compartmentalizing our individual life from God with the larger world that we inhabit. And so how is it possible that we can have silence and solitude and never talk about race? How is it possible that we can talk about meditation on scripture and not talk about justice? How is it possible we can be Sabbathing ourselves to death and not really talking about the powers that are at work in the world that are causing the poor and the marginalized to suffer more and more? So for me, that's a very anemic, compartmentalized view of formation. And this is my approach of saying, I think not to talk about these things, specifically in our American context, is to have a lot of, I think at least lots of self-congratulatory postures around I'm doing right with God, yet at the same time, I'm not equipped to address some of the larger forces of fragmentation in our world.
And I think that that's a real epidemic, because we have so many people who will be found in church pews on Sundays, but will readily live in ways and vote in ways that will harm people that Jesus was really concerned about, like had a real heart for.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's back to like in the deeply formed life, I mentioned there's a kind of formational compartmentalization where we place such an emphasis on one thing to the extent where we're missing. So it's an imbalanced kind of formation where, largely speaking, in the evangelical tradition, it's just like right thinking. If you can just check the right theological boxes, you're okay. Whereas in some Pentecostal charismatic traditions, it's like right experiences. If you just had the right experience, then you're doing well. And then in some contexts, it's just right action. That if you just did the right things, you don't really have to worry about your interior life or worry about your life with God. But if you were just doing the right things, the justice things, the evangelism things, whatever it might be, you're doing okay. And I think each of those, if taken independently, can lead to some really disjointed spirituality that leads people not formed, I think, in the full way that Jesus is inviting us into.
As I was reading the books, I kept having this memory of in one of Thomas Merton's books, he talks, it's just kind of like a side thing that he mentions in passing, but like the idea that there were men in the monasteries who had been there for decades who still had like a terrible temper and a short fuse. And so, they were literally religiously, they're practicing, prayer and meditation and all this stuff, but they were like failing to be transformed. And, I can't help but wonder if it goes back to their view of God, and that James Bryan Smith talks about this all the time. If you're practicing the disciplines, but you're doing it to get closer to a bad image of God, that will not help you.
Yes. Yeah. The reason I'm smiling is because I've read a lot of Merton and read many of his journals, and to see first of all, lots of people didn't like Merton in the monastery, especially his abbot. who Merton has lots of things to say about his abbot, as well as his fellow monks. In fact, at one point, Merton says something to the effect of, "You guys are not contemplatives; you're just introverts," and which they didn't take well to that one either. But I think, to your point, how is it that you can be in a monastery praying all day long in Scripture, and at the same time, there's something missing in your formation around loving well, around your own reactivity? Which, number one, it gives me hope. Number one, that it makes me feel all right that if monks are struggling with this, that, man, praise God, I'm not as bad as I think. But the other side of it is, I think there's far more. The formational compartmentalization is what gets us in some really bad places spiritually.
Well, how do you think how can we practice this interior examination that you talk about, and it not become like either like an unhealthy self-criticism, or become like a very individualistic, I think we're kind of seeing this in like therapy culture, where we're kind of taking these terms and like weaponizing them, and it's really just a kind of a hyper individualism, right? Where we stay in our heads, and it's all and it's a very self-focused sort of thing.
Yeah, I would say, insofar that emotional health and the language we use therein is in service of integrity, integration, and love, I would say, insofar that it's serving that, we're on the right track. And so, and what I mean by integrity is there's congruence, interior congruence and exterior congruence. What I mean by integration is that we are able to take all the various parts of who we are and hold them together in worship before God. But also love. The primary goal of interior examination, emotional health, is to be in service of love. It's in service of the everlasting way, which is why Psalm 139, towards the end, I believe verse 23 and 24, when David says, "Search me, O God, know my anxious thoughts, test me and see if there's any, way of pain in me or offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." David is not, his cry for interior examination or self-awareness is not simply to self-actualization. It's not for me to be more aware. It's, I want to be led in the way everlasting. I want to be led in your way. And what is that way? That is the way of love. That is the way of hope. That is the way of faith. And so, yes, I think the therapeutic, the question is, to what degree is theology shaping the way, our view of God, shaping the way we think about the interior life, versus to what degree is therapy? And I don't think they're mutually, they don't cancel each other out. But I do believe, how are we even starting the conversation with this? Is this in service of love and service of the glory of God? Or is this in service of me just getting better or more self-aware? And which is a great thing. But if that's the emphasis, I think it'll short circuit ultimately what God is hoping to do in us as we grow in greater self-awareness.
That's really helpful. I think you use the word self-actualization, and I think that I feel like in America, like we're so trained to like everything is in service to self-actualization, like we're all just waiting to go to summer camp, and like that counselor's gonna take us under his wing, and we're gonna, become a new person, we're gonna grow into ourselves. Right. And like, I'm 42 and I'm still waiting for it to happen. Right. And I think where it does go wrong, like you were kind of pointing at, is like we enter spiritual disciplines, a life of contemplation, with the aim of self-actualization. Yeah. And we'll be disappointed if that's the case. Yeah.
If self-actualization is the goal, which is, at its core, I'm reaching my full potential. And and there's something there about good stewardship and what God has entrusted me with. But if the goal again is myself and not primarily how am I now joining my life to God in such a way that brings God glory, and how am I joining my life to others in such a way where because of my life, others are being loved and supported and they're flourishing as well. I think it's the end point. It's what is this in service of? And I think self-actualization begins with the self and usually ends with the self. And that's not the Jesus way.
And how do people move beyond a transactional prayer life to something a little more robust? Like we Protestants, we are not good at contemplation. We're not really good at meditation, and even our just prayer as we think of common prayer is often really transactional. And so for someone who maybe is new to that conversation, like how do you start in that?
I think I would start just analogically and basically say that some of the deepest relationships we have with others are the relationships that make space for presence. And by presence, I mean presence without the need for words. I think our ability to be present with someone without the need to fill up the space with words, with our verbosity, in many respects, is a reflection of the depth of life we have with that person. And so I would say the same is true with God. I think our desire to remain verbose with God, wordy with God, in many respects reflects our unease with who God is and what it means to simply be with God. And so I would start there. Secondly, I would say, I think biblically, the theme of the wilderness, the theme of the desert, the theme of solitude and silence, it's all throughout the scriptures. And what we find in the life of Jesus, in the life of David, in the life of Mary, in the life of Paul, in the life of Moses, in the life of Elijah, are people who have made space to meet with God in stillness, in contemplation. In the desert tradition, 200, 300 years after the resurrection of Jesus, what we find is the church has prioritized this. And so I would start there. And then I would say this, for those who this is new for, I would say a little bit in Jesus' hands goes a long way. And whether it might be 2 minutes of just stillness, 5 minutes where you set your timer on your phone and say, you know what, I just want to be attentive to the presence of God. And the goal is not to get anything out of it. The goal is to recognize that it is in Him that I live and move and have my being, that life is a gift, that I'm breathing today because God is merciful to me. And I just want to live with greater attentiveness to the presence of God. And whether that's 1 minute or 2 minutes, and we work our way to building our capacity to do that, that doesn't mean that there's no room for words. In fact, Jesus tells us to pray, give us this day our daily bread. He tells us to ask for things. But I think order is important. Even in the Lord's Prayer, He doesn't start with our Father in heaven, give us this day our daily bread. It's our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done. And so I would say a little bit in Jesus' hands goes a long way for someone who's looking to begin to go down a road of the contemplative life.
I mean, I think what I like about that is that I've seen in my own life when I do these spiritual disciplines, this contemplation, this meditation, I bring to it a Protestant work ethic in the worst way. And what I mean is, like, I've got to figure out how to get good at this and work really hard to be good at contemplation, which is like, it really is like so impossible when you bring that energy, right? Because the whole point is to let it take over you. Like, let the
Yes.
presence of Jesus take the wheel, right?
Yes.
And so when you come at it going, I'm going to spend an hour in contemplation every morning and, and check this off my list, right?
And I'm going to get really good at it too.
Exactly.
Like,
yeah. I'm going to try so hard to do this, and that's the whole thing is like trying softer,
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It does remind me back to Merton, where there's always this provocative and kind of, in some ways, like exclusive statement that writers have of that the greatest enemy of the spiritual life is hurry. But Merton would say something similar, in that he would say that the greatest enemy of the spiritual life is efficiency. And I think when doing something right in as much, in as little time as possible, is the operating system that is shaping our spiritual life, we're going to miss it totally. That the goal is not trying to learn something and do something with as little time as possible to maximize the rest of my day. The goal is, what does it mean for me to surrender these particular values for the sake of being attentive to the presence of God, which feels like, in many respects, a waste of time. And that's the mystery of it. It does feel like a waste of time. And at the same time, there's something time is being redeemed in some sense as we do that.
The Merton quote reminds me of, and this is a paraphrase, but like, Henry Nouwen says something about like, the role of a pastor is to be like irrelevant. Yeah. And I feel like those together like get me really far. Like I feel like so much of an authentic journey with Jesus is being inefficient and being irrelevant. And that is so radically difficult for people who are immersed in American culture.
Yeah, Nouwen would say in one of his books, where he's known to talk about the three temptations of Jesus, of turning stone into bread and jumping from the temple and bowing at the devil, of these temptations to be relevant, to be spectacular, to be powerful. And I think that relevant piece in the first one hits it right on the head there. The goal is not to be relevant insofar that my life matters in such a way that's measured by the way the culture regards significance and importance. But there's something else deeper that's at work that God is inviting me to pay attention to.
Yeah, that's so good. I wanted to mention your Seminary Now course, which is based on The Deeply Formed Life, the book you wrote in 2021. Yeah. I was so impressed with this. Like, for one, just the production value is so good. And like the cliche, like New York City is a character in this film. Like It felt like that. You're in these like great, like beautiful places in New York City. And the thing I've noticed this about a lot of Seminary Now courses, but the thing I kept thinking when I was watching it was, it's based on the book, but it's not like, and look, everybody should go read the book, get the book, read it. But it's not like just a little taste appetizer of the book. Like you give some real meat in that course. And I mean, the whole thing's like, over an hour long. So, I mean, really like there's really good stuff there. Did you have a good experience filming that? Was that fun?
It was wonderful actually. And in some ways this might be a bit selfish here. Like I found myself, it was a gift just for me to start repeating and getting these things in me. Like, oh yeah, this is what I've said, and Lord, help me to live into this. This is what I've said about contemplative life. And Lord, I know how easy it is for me to write things that I'm not living. And so number one, to do that was just a great gift for me and revisiting some of that content. But no, it was to offer, I also didn't want just to take what was in the book and just put it to a video. And so what were the other particular angles that I thought would be helpful? So yeah, it was a wonderful experience, however.
like total left turn here, and if you're like, I understand if you can't say much about this, but just as a church of, a lot of people who have immigrated from different places, in a time where a lot of immigrants are just not safe right now. Yeah. Has that been, something that you're dealing with as a pastor with your people?
Absolutely. Just 50% of Queens is foreign born. Mm. And so just by virtue of that very simple statistic, and that's out of the 5 boroughs of New York City, there's, Queens is the most international of the boroughs. And so, when I think about what's going on socially and politically, I'm not thinking about mirages of people. I'm not thinking about great swaths of people. I have names of people. Histories of people I've baptized, people I've married, people, family members that I've had to oversee funerals for. These are not just some random faceless people. And so, absolutely, I mean, from early on, even before things were getting ramping up in terms of rhetoric around immigrants and such, our community was thinking about, how do we serve refugees and immigrants? We have a whole kind of local outreach wing of our church called our New Life Community Development Corporation, which serves marginalized, under-resourced, overlooked people within Queens through a wide array of programming. And so this is not something that comes to our attention based on executive orders or something that's changing this is stuff that we are constantly, weekly, and daily thinking about. And so, which makes it that much more urgent and that much more painful and disruptive. And at the same time, we're trying to be a kind of community and bear witness to a particular gospel. But yeah, this is something we've had to address for a number of years now.
Yeah. I think, you mentioned there's like the kind of direct effect of policy changes, executive orders, that sort of thing. But there's also like a secondary effect, which I think we saw in 2016, where you saw during that time that like hate crimes went up and like instances of immigrants and just everybody who's not white being dehumanized. And it's just this kind of like secondary effect that's not like legislation in itself, but
Correct.
Makes it, again, a more vulnerable place for immigrants in our lives.
Here's the difference. Under every administration, Democrat or Republican, there has been policy legislations around immigration, deportations, which is why total immigration reform is needed in the most desperate way. But this is something that's consistent no matter who's president or who runs Congress and all the rest. The difference, however, is when you have that plus dehumanizing language, that plus a particular ethos around lumping every single immigrant into categories of criminality and such. Mm-hmm. That within itself now creates a whole different dynamic that is far more pervasive than simply a policy. So when it's a policy plus the demonization, there's now a new power that's introduced. And a new effect that's introduced. And I think that is one of the more grievous aspects of what happened and what has happened in our culture around that. And so one could say, you know what, there's been policies left and right, Republican, Democrat around this here, that under Obama, many were deported from the United States. And that's true. That's absolutely true. And what's true is that when you have rhetoric plus policy, there's a whole new life, a whole new reality that's entered into the conversation, and that's what makes it very difficult and painful and grievous.
Yeah. Yep. Do you feel as a pastor just thinking about not only this issue, but just controversial stuff that divides us.
Yeah.
Is it tricky to figure out when, okay, we can hold these differing opinions together, and when, okay, this does not need to be both sided. And we need, like, we need to pick a side on this.
It's very difficult on a couple of levels. One level is when the nature of it's a very dangerous place to be a pastor in New Life Fellowship Church where I'm at because of our immense diversity. And I would go as far as to say my pastoral kind of assessment is in the last few elections, 30% has, voted for Donald Trump, 30% for Biden or Harris, 20% for Spider-Man because he's from Queens, and then folks who just can't vote because of their immigration status. And so to have that in one place is very stressful. Moreover, what's complicated for me as a pastor is this. I have to continually work to not just discern the difference, but to recognize what's my priority. My priority is not to pastor the internet. And whenever I get into pastoring the internet, I get into a lot of trouble. My primary goal is to pastor the community that God has entrusted to me. And how can I wrap my mind and my priorities around this group of people and speak and in so many respects, and which means there are times where, because of how I believe God has called me, there are times where I might say things publicly and that people are overhearing what I'm saying to our congregation. But in a social media world, those lines are never super clear, and it's increasingly difficult. So my biggest task is to remind myself I'm not pastoring the internet. I'm pastoring this group of people in Queens, New York City. And others might be overhearing. And I think that making that distinction, at least in my mind, is helping me to pastor more effectively. And yet I feel the constant pull of wanting to name out loud, hey, there's a different way of following Jesus. I want to bear witness publicly as well to Jesus and his love. So I find myself, Shane, in a very difficult position almost on a weekly basis.
I can imagine you do. And I would think that would be doubly hard when, you came into a church who, before you got there, the founding pastor was a well-known author, had a kind of a national platform. And now you're writing yourself, you're speaking places. And we also live in a world where it's very, there are really good reasons to, for instance, have your sermons on the internet, because, you have elderly people that can't make it in person every week. You have sick people that can't make it in person every week, right? Yeah. It's not just about growing your influence. Like, there are real pastoral reasons. And yet you've got to talk to your people every week and keep that in mind. I would imagine that's doubly hard. And I was thinking too, I had someone I had on my podcast years ago who's also happens to be a New York City pastor. I had sent out a questionnaire beforehand and said, is there anything you don't want me to talk about? And he said, I don't want to talk about hot button issues. Those are things I deal with pastorally, locally. And I think some people could see that as being cowardly. I experienced it as being very wise, that he knew there are certain conversations that are going to be better in someone's living room over coffee sitting next to them. Yes. And not that there aren't prophets who have national platforms to talk about, immigration and all that stuff. Like, I totally get that. But I think that we get confused when we all think we're that person, That's exactly right.
And I think there's that internet embodied community dynamic, and then there's just a calling dynamic as well. Like there are certain people that God has not called them to speak publicly on that, and it would be really well just to respect and not see every person who doesn't step into those spaces as cowardly. And if your pastor doesn't say this on the internet about XYZ, find a new church. Well, you know what? You should find a new church then. Because if you are putting the pressure on every pastor to say what you want them to say, how you want them to say it, when you want them to say it, in the particular context you want them to say that, you might as well be a pastor if that's the case. And so I think some pastors feel, I rather deal with this in the particular congregation that God has entrusted me with, as opposed to I have to now say everything so that everyone could hear what I think about this particular issue. Not everyone's called to that.
That's right. Rich, I've kept you long enough. Like I said, I've wanted to have you on for so long. I can't believe we're just now having this conversation. Man, people should go out and get the books, get your watch your Seminary Now course. Like I said, was so good, so refreshing. But The Deeply Formed Life, Good and Beautiful Kind, and just last year, most recently, The Narrow Path. These are beautiful. In my mind, I can't help but see them as a trilogy. So I think people should read all three of them. They can stand alone, but I really think people should read all of them together. I think they're fantastic.
Thank you, Shane.
So, Rich, man, if you ever make it down to Austin, I'll take you out for barbecue.
That sounds amazing, and I need to put that on my to-do list for sure.
Please do. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
That's all for today, friends. I hope you found something helpful. Remember to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it. You can support Seminary Dropout by going to supportseminarydropout.com. Remember, all past episodes, 200 plus of them, can be found at seminarydropout.com. You can find me on almost all social media channels. My handle is ThatShaneB. All right, friends, we'll see you next time.